Hello everyone and welcome to another Ford Focus Mark 1 parts information video number 3. And today I am going to focus on suspension parts, predominantly suspension parts, because this is a question that is cropping up every single day from a variety of different people. So I thought I would give my advice in one straight shot video, and I think this is a very good way of doing this. There are numerous parts on a Focus Mark 1 suspension. It is not a simple car with a rear trailing beam suspension, torsion beam suspension, as featured on Fiestas of the same age and beyond, or newer Focuses, I would say, and certainly most cars today, and certainly a lot of fun suspension as well. The suspension system for me is what gives the car its WAS, its special factor, that absolute special golden factor, which gives you that pin sharp handling, but the compromise between fantastic handling and fantastic comfort. And it is that rear suspension, that rear control blade suspension, which was based on a redesign of the Mark 1, Mark 2 rear suspension on the Mondeo. That suspension was pretty much the basis of the control blade suspension, but the control blade is a bit more compact and perfect for the Focus. And one of its biggest assets is the way it makes the car handle. But as time has gone on and these cars have aged, we are starting to see numerous problems. It is a multi-link rear suspension and it sounds fantastic when they're brand new. It sounds and has been fantastic the last 15, 20 years plus, but it's not fantastic when you have clunks, knocks, warm bushes and wayward steering, wayward handling round corners, and that is not how a Mark 1 should feel. And sadly there are many Mark 1s going around even today. Majority of them are still on their original, predominantly original suspension, with a few new parts in there, maybe the odd new spring because they tend to crack, so people tend to replace the spring but nothing else. So a lot of these Mark 1s are on tyre suspension. So what parts do you go for, or what parts do you need? Well, we're going to have a look at a few items. Firstly, starting at the front suspension, and then we'll work to the back. So front suspension, you're going to need this. This is the top strut bearing at the front, okay? So it is part of the McPherson strut assembly, okay? It goes on the top. Basically, you have a little metal cup that sits above the spring, so you've got the spring that sits on the shocker, and at the top you've got a metal plate, and that plate is the top plate for the spring. But basically on a Mark 1 you have this that is wedged between that and the body, and the purpose of a strut bearing is simply when you turn the steering, the McPherson strut with the spring and shocker turns and twists with the steering. But how do you actually allow it to rotate without anything clashing or grinding or rubbing? Well, you have this, and it is literally a circular bearing that just circulates. And you can see it in the picture here. You've got 3 nuts with it, a circular bearing, and that is what is inside the actual strut itself, the strut bearing itself. Now, the common complaint is when they start to fail, people get a grinding noise when you're turning the steering, particularly at dry steering. Dry steering, turn the steering wheel around. You should only hear a hissing from the hydraulic power steering system. You should not hear any grinding or any other noises. Do not confuse that with suspension issues elsewhere. That is a top strut bearing issue, and unfortunately it's going to need replacing. Therefore the whole McPherson strut is going to come off, and that might make you think about changing a number of components while you're at it, because I just think you are costing yourself a lot of time, and if you're paying a gouge to do it, I think you're costing yourself in the long run if you want to keep a Mark 1 long term. This one is a mill. It's got a couple of years warranty on it, and that is what is fitted to my Focus Mark 1. I don't think that a genuine one is significantly any better. I might be wrong, maybe time will tell, but I've had it on the car 3 or 4 years now, not a sausage of a problem. However, if you're looking for a bit of a kit and you're going to go down the length of a couple of things, well, I'm going to show you a few things now, starting with this picture. So this is a common kit that you get on eBay, and these are good kits. Some of them are not so good. Some of them have been found to have ball joints and drop links that kind of have torn gaiters and knocking ball joints within a year or two. Our roads are not very good. but I would advise just to avoid potholes as much as possible, because aftermarket ball joints, in my opinion, don't tend to last very long if you abuse them. The genuine stuff can take the brunt, but they're very expensive. I wouldn't recommend genuine Wishbones or any parts at the front other than good quality aftermarket parts. I would have a look around. There is no brand for this particular set, but Merl does it, KYB. There's a few other companies, Febby Bilstein, that's another good name. And as you can see, this kit not only comes with the bottom Wishbones, it comes with the strut bearing, very important, as we've just seen, and the drop links. And really, that's the majority of the suspension sorted. Obviously, we've got a couple of other things like the shock absorber with a mattress and strut assembly with the shock absorber and spring, because no doubt you're probably going to want to replace them at the same time as well. And believe you me, if you manage to get this set, you're sorting a lot of problems, because I can tell you now, it's not just the ball joint that causes an issue, and that's the reason, the main reason why these Wishbones are replaced is because it gets picked up on the MOT, ball joint's got too much play in it, it needs to be replaced. Good. Just replace the whole thing. I don't know why people bother to grind and cut the ball joints off. You see those little pot rivets in the picture at the end where the ball joints is, and there's two, actually there's three of them. There's three of them. Why do people grind them off and then bother to punch them out when they can, well, basically I've seen some really cheap ones of them where you have to put a bolt and nut to hold it in place. I don't like them at all. Just replace the whole thing, because if a ball joint has been knocked out, unless it's particularly young or faulty item, most likely the inner bushes, the two inner bushes that keep it held in the inner subframe, the front subframe, they'll be worn as well. And I've known instances where they've worn so much, it's actually pulled the drive shaft out of the gearbox and you've lost drive as a result. So make sure that you need to stay on top of them Wishbones. If you're in doubt, just replace them. It really is a no-brainer. This set is about £120 or retails for around about that. Could be more, could be less, depending on the manufacturer. Drop links. Mark 1 Focuses love drop links and they will eat them for breakfast, and I've had to replace mine twice, mainly because the second time I replaced it, well, the first time I replaced it, I bought some cheap ones and I learnt my lesson. Cheap drop links that cost 10-12 quid, I am going to tell you to throw them in the bin. You've just wasted £12. I will not even tell you to bother to put them on the car. They will last 2 seconds with a Mark 1. Mark 1's put an extreme amount of stress on its suspension. And I will come to the spring issue in a second, but drop links, they go out so often. Sometimes it's because they're just poor quality. Sometimes it's just because Mark 1s are not compromising. That reason why you get that class-leading handling that the Mark 1 is famous for is unfortunately caused a byproduct where the suspension gets a bit bashed and bruised very easily. And drop links are the weakest link in a Mark 1 Focus, so please use quality ones. I would say the ones in this kit, I wouldn't necessarily buy this kit. I would probably buy the Wishbones separately, the strut bearing separately, and the drop links separately. Drop links, go for Lem Forder if you can, because Lem Forder make them for Ford and Ford put their badge on them, so they're OEM. Lem Forder. I'm going to say Lem Forder a few times in this episode, so please do so. Very easy to change, not a problem. Anyway, next. If you're in any doubt about the bolts as well, when you're changing the lower Wishbones, now there's a couple of bolts you need to be aware about. There's two bolts, well, there's actually three. There's one bolt that goes in the front where it connects to the subframe. There's two bolts that go up, and there's another bolt that pinches the ball joint to the bottom of the hub. Okay, now the three bolts, the main bolt that goes through the front of the cross member, and the two rear ones, they rarely give issues. The front one is a torque to yield, and they are stretch bolts, and you aren't supposed to change them really. I've never known an issue. The Wishbones on mine, well, the actual passenger one has been changed twice because, again, a faulty part or cheap part that got knocked out, the ball joint got knocked out, and it's been off a couple of times, and I've had no issues with that bolt whatsoever. As long as you torque them up really well and you do it to the book, you will not have an issue with that bolt, trust me. So you can reuse them, but there's one bolt that is cheap and freely available in the aftermarket world, and it's this. And it is the pinch bolt that basically pinches the ball joint to the bottom of the hub underneath the brake disc, okay? You must change it. I think it's a Torx T40 or T40 or T50, I should say. T40, 45, 50 or whatever it is. You will need probably a bit of braking. By the way, they are known to actually round those Torx heads. They are known to round, and you probably have to cut a little slit in it with a little grinder and then basically hold it with a screwdriver and then get your socket on the nut and wind it off. Once you've got the nut off, punch it through, all good. They're not really known for seizing. They can get a bit stuck in, but please replace them. You must order this. If you're buying new Wishbones, please order these pinch bolts. It's stupid to not change them. So, next one. Coil springs on a Mark 1 Focus. Okay, now coil springs are a known fault on a Mark 1 Focus. They will crack, front or rear, usually the fronts more than the rears. That is slightly down to an age-related factor. They get weak, they get a bit rusty where the ends go, and they snap. Usually at the ends, they don't usually snap in the middle. That happens on a number of cars, but Mark 1s are very uncompromising on the springs when the springs get a bit old and a bit rusty. And to find a Mark 1 that hasn't had cracked springs, believe it or not, the original springs on my car, the all four that got took off a few years ago, they had not cracked. Maybe it's because I avoid the potholes, I drive sensibly, and I'm very sympathetic with the suspension. If, however, you went and was a bit more Mark 1 driver-ish like, because that's the way they're supposed to be driven, these will snap when they get old. So it's a good idea to change the springs and the shock absorbers, which I'm going to come to next. Springs, don't go for genuine ones. You're going to get stung by Ford. 90 quid, 80 quid. I've seen some for over 100 quid. Don't bother. Just get the correct parts number and change them. Now, there's one thing I will have to say about Mark 1 front springs and rear springs, particularly the front ones, is that in all the specifications of a Mark 1, you've got the CL, LX, Z-Tech gear, ST170. Forget the ST170 because they have their own specific springs to spec. Unfortunately, what we've got is a situation where Ford had a number of different springs. And I've looked at the parts numbers for all the springs on a Mark 1 Focus and shock absorbers. There's so many of them as well. There's about 20, 30 different types. Some of them were discontinued and then recontinued. Some of them were for the ride height pack, and then some of them didn't have the ride height pack. There's so many different types. Now, the ride height pack personally would have been related to a Z-Tech. The ride height pack would have been a bit lower. Z-Techs have slightly lower suspension from the factory. Unfortunately, you can't really tell the difference these days because one, the Z-Techs that have got the original front springs still, they've got old and they've gone even lower because they're getting tired. So they wouldn't be at the correct height. And when people put standard springs on them, they look much higher than what they were originally. Unfortunately, unless you want to go to Ford and pay about £120 the privilege, and I refuse to, then you're not going to have the original suspension height on your Z-Tech. Now, all I will say is the parts numbers are very clashy, put it that way, with the aftermarket manufacturers. KYB, for instance, like every single one of them, they actually identify a standard Focus Mark 1 spring with a Z-Tech spring. And when I mean standard spring, standard ride height, okay? That can be for the CL, LX and gear. So softer springs, taller, softer springs, okay? Only fractionally taller though. The automatic models, did you know the automatic models were a bit taller? Well, there's no real difference between the aftermarket ones for the automatic models and the manuals. They're all intermixed. If you've got an automatic, you've generally put an aftermarket spring on that was also designed for manuals as well. It's all mixed up, and quite frankly, it's all about how well do you want your Mark 1 to sit on a standard basis. And the truth is, you're going to have to buy standard front springs. Personally, the front springs on my car are KYBs. In this picture, they are completely standard, and I didn't really notice a difference. Maybe the old Z-Tech springs had got so tired that I actually failed to notice the difference from when I first bought the car. Possibly, but I didn't really notice a difference. And if you don't notice a difference and the ride height looks okay and it looks quite sensible, there's no problem, is there? And the same for the rear ones as well. It's the same for the rear ones. You know, at the end of the day, all Mark 1 Focuses are going to have the same suspension springs. It's as simple as, unless it's an ST170, because the aftermarket manufacturers don't make springs specifically for Z-Techs, okay? Unlike Ford. If you want to go to Ford and pay the privilege, please do so, but trust me, it's not worth it. Just live with something that may be fractionally different, and if I don't notice, you're not going to notice. So, anyway, shock absorbers. These can retail for about £56, something like that. Now, I'm not giving any parts numbers in this episode because these are all aftermarket items. KYB, just go for KYB, whether it's rear shock hubs, front shockers, okay? And there's something you need to know about both the front and rear shock hubs. They don't come with the boot kit, okay? You'll have a little sponge for the rear shock absorbers. It's like a little yellow sponge. If it's in poor condition, you're going to have to go to Ford for it. You could go for aftermarket ones. They'll come in a kit with the yellow sponge and the boot kit. Same for the fronts, get the boot kit. It will have everything, okay, to cover everything up, and you might as well replace it. It will just be a nice thing. If you're replacing it all brand new, it's all good. Again, shock absorbers, you'll have the same shock absorbers regardless of whether it's a CO, LX, Zetec, gear, as far as the aftermarket manufacturers are concerned. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the Zetec ones have a slightly firmer shock absorber rate, but the others, they've just got soft suspension. But unfortunately, again, many people are going to have the issue where the front shock hubs are on their Zetec, if they're KYBs or any of the aftermarket item, they will be given the softer feel suspension. But I personally think you won't really notice a difference unless you are a keen driver, put it that way. So don't worry about that. It's all done with that. But I was very lucky. I managed to get genuine Ford shock absorbers at the rear for about 50 quid a corner. And the genuine rear shock absorbers come with the new yellow sponge and a boot kit. It all looks really, really nice. So I could replace all that in one situ. I was lucky like that. Whereas if you buy the aftermarket ones, you've got to replace all that in a separate kit. So just be aware about that one. The front shock absorbers are genuine ones. Again, I managed to buy them at 50 quid a corner a couple of years ago when they were very cheap. They are more expensive now and harder to find for the right specification. So my Zetec is running on the correct shock absorbers, but not the correct springs at the front. And I've got ST170 rear springs. I won't go into that because I've already explained why I've got ST170 springs. Rear springs in terms of everything else, if you've bought standard rear springs, don't be surprised if the rear end of the car sits much higher than it did before because the old springs were a bit tired, but also the springs do not set the ride height, guys. It's the rear bushes. It's all the rear bushes because there's something called the design ride height setting in that Haynes manual. Go and look it up if you don't understand what it is, but it means that you can torque all the bushes up to hold the suspension at a certain ride height. It's not the springs. The springs are merely the thing that compress suspension under pressure. It's as simple as that. But I was having an issue where the standard rear springs from KYB were too tall. They looked stupid. It looked like it was jacked up. It was horrible. I put ST170 front rear springs on the car, and now it's actually gone back to a standard ride height setting for a Zetec, which looks perfect. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the bushes to play ball, so just word of warning on that one. Rear suspension now. Right, this is the rear train arm suspension bush. Now this bush, 1061670. That is 1061670. These are 50 quid each. I would personally go for aftermarket ones. Febby Bilstein, I've got them on mine. And after a few years, there's minute evidence of cracking. They are under severe stress. And I will tell you something, I think if you were to change just one component of that rear suspension, that will make a lot of difference. The most difference you're going to feel going around corners, it's that. That will make your car handle like night and day. They really do make a huge difference. So, and there is a proper tool for doing it in situ. If you just want to replace the bush, there is a proper tool. I've got the tool. It's about 60, 70 pounds. But for me, it's worth it because I'm going to do this job a couple of times with other people's cars. But for most people don't want to do that. You can punch it out, but you've got to find a way of getting it back in properly. Using a block of wood is a bit difficult, I can assure you. But these make a huge difference. So you can go aftermarket. You don't have to go for genuine Ford ones, but they make the most difference. Now, the next one that I'm just going to show you quickly is this. We have a rear suspension kit, but this is not the complete kit, this one. This is about £70, and it's the control arm kit. These are the control arms. The two upper ones in the picture are the banana arms, as we can see. Do not get them confused. There is a little inscription on that banana arm that says front, and that has to face the front of the car, because guess who got them mixed up and basically put them both on back to front? Yeah, that might have been a bit of a mistake, and it's easy done as well because they can actually fit both ways. And then you've got the lower radius arms, which are big, thick, heavy things. They do tend to rust out really badly. The bushes tend to be quite long-lived from the factory, but these will replace the knackered ones and bolt to a very good subframe. They'll be great. They come with bolts. This is the kit that I actually bought, strange enough, but it came with train arm bushes as well. It was a Febby kit. But it comes with all new bolts. Don't worry about genuine Ford bolts. These do not need genuine Ford bolts. You can use the ones that are supplied with a bit of Loctite. They look great, perfect, job done. And that's quite a satisfying job. Now, to put them on the car is a different thing, because you're going to have to probably do a bit of jacking up of the hub. You'll probably have to get the car and axle stands, obviously, and then you're going to have to get a jack underneath the hub to kind of move the whole hub knuckle to actually line in the bolts, because it's a bit tricky otherwise. They can be a bit of a faff. But anyway, next one is the complete rear suspension rebuild kit. Everything, including train arm bushes, the little drop links at the bottom where they tend to go out a little bit, and all the bolts and the D bushes for the rear anti-roll bar. Don't neglect them. Now, this kit will also come with, as well as all the bolts, it will come with the 2 camber bolts. If you look in that picture, if you can see, the furthest left bolt is the camber bolt. It's a special shaped camber bolt, and we'll actually show you another detailed picture of that in a second. But it comes with everything, including the big cup bottom arms that tend to rust out. It just doesn't come with any springs, so you just have to buy the rear spring separately, obviously. But these sort of kits go for about 200 quid, all in one. This is a Merle kit, and I think that will do you some good, actually. I think that will last years and years and years. I really do, and I don't think it will give you many problems. And it is a fantastic kit, and it will just encourage people to do this. I mean, Mark 1 Focuses are so good for parts, it's untrue. There are so many aftermarket manufacturers that make this stuff. They make it easy for you to make your suspensions as it was from the factory, believe you me. So these kits are worth it. Don't look at the genuine Ford stuff. Again, aftermarket, save the money. It's not worth it, not at this time. The last item, I should say, that I'm going to come to are these. The Eccentric camber bolts. Now, this is the one in the left-hand side of the old picture, but this is a detailed look. You do have the bolt. It is keyed. You get a little cam that slots into the thread on one side, and it is used to adjust the camber of the rear arms. That is what your MOT or your garage will use when your car goes in for wheel alignment for its tracking. And it's good to have new ones, because you can't use the old ones, they'll be seized. Please, please, please put copperies on them bolts. The other thing I was going to say in the last video is the 4 bolts that you really need to potentially get genuine are probably these 2. I wouldn't recommend these as aftermarket ones, but there's some decent ones out there. But I think the aftermarket ones are probably more likely to snap after several years of sitting in place and not basically rusting away to the metal. Now, there is a way of going about that. When you put these in, you put copperies on the shaft and Loctite on the thread. It sounds mad, doesn't it? But you do. Put copperies where it goes through the bush and Loctite on that nut to make sure it's not going to go anywhere. So it's only got Loctite where it needs Loctite, and the rest of it will be freed up. So please, if you put copperies on these 2 and the other 2 on the hubs, you should be fine. But I would recommend that these 4 bolts are genuine Ford bolts. They're 10 quid each. They're not cheap for a reason. So you might have to consider your options there. And it's getting really dark now, and this is where I'm going to leave this episode here. I hope this episode has been useful, and I think it has been useful to every single one of you, because suspension is the #1 topic on a Focus Mark 1, as well as rust. But it usually is coming up, and Mark 1s that have got all their rear suspension components, or most of them, I'm going to need some work in this department. So I hope this episode is going to be useful for a number of people. If you've got a comment, or you've got a question, put it in the comments. Please bear with, because there's a lot of people asking me questions at the moment, and there's only one Andrew. So anyway, you take care, guys. I shall see you in another episode, part 4, which will be God knows when.